I'd be less surprised if I saw a bear standing on its hind legs in the middle of the road. I'm 71 now. I've spent almost my entire life living near the forest. First as an assistant forester, then a forester, then a senior forester. You could say I've spent most of my life surrounded by pines, swamps, and old clearings. Over those years, I've seen it all. I've found people lost in the taiga, encountered poachers, and weathered forest fires. Once, I even spent 3 days up in a tree while a mother bear and her cubs paced below. But what happened that autumn still haunts me to this day. It happened at the end of September. That autumn was damp. For nearly a week, heavy clouds hung over the bush. The rain came down one wave after another. The roads washed out so badly that in some places it was impossible to drive through, even in my old Jeep. When the weather finally cleared, I needed to check a remote section of the forest near an old clearing. This clearing had been around for a very long time. Once upon a time, they were going to lay a power line through there, but the project was canceled. All that was left of the road was a wide strip cut through the forest. I knew it like the back of my hand. Every bump, every fallen trunk, every bend in the trail. Over 40 years, I'd walked it hundreds of times. So when I saw the cabin, I first thought I'd taken the wrong turn. I stopped and looked around. No, everything was right. To the left, the old cedar with the split top. To the right, the little swamp that never freezes over completely. And ahead, a small cabin built of dark logs with a sagging roof. It stood about 50 yards from the clearing, and I'd swear on anything. Just a week ago, it wasn't there. I cut the engine. For a few seconds, I just sat there and stared.
A strange feeling surfaced. Not fear, exactly. More like irritation, because my brain was trying to find an explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe someone built it recently, but that was impossible. To get building materials out here, you'd need machinery. To build a house like that would take several days of work. And I had walked past here just a week ago. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I got out of the car. The forest was silent. It's that kind of silence you only get after the rain. Not even the birds were audible, just droplets falling from the branches every now and then. I walked toward the cabin. With every step, the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. As I got closer, I noticed another oddity. The house looked old, very old. It didn't look like a fresh construction. The logs were darkened, covered in moss in places. Grass was growing on the roof, as if the cabin had been sitting there for 20 years, or maybe more. I circled it. No tracks from machinery, no signs of construction, nothing. Just wet grass and old trees. There was only one window, small and dirty. I looked inside. Darkness. I could barely see anything. I only had the impression of a table inside, and something like a stove. The door wasn't locked. I pulled it toward me. The hinges creaked clearly. Inside, it smelled of wood. Not rot, not dampness, but just wood. As if the owner had recently warmed the place up. I stepped inside. The floor didn't creak under my feet. In the corner, there really was a stove. By the wall, a wooden bed. And in the middle, a table. An ordinary hunting cabin. Nothing special. But for some reason, my heart was beating faster than usual. On the table lay a mug. An old metal mug. I picked it up and froze. It was warm. Not hot, just warm.
As if someone had been holding it only a few minutes ago. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly scanned the room. No one, no personal belongings, no traces of an owner. Only this cursed warm mug. I think that was the first time I wanted to leave. To just turn around and drive away. To not look for explanations.
to not ask questions. But age makes a man stubborn. The longer you live, the less you like riddles. I decided to come back tomorrow, prepared to look carefully, examine the tracks, maybe talk to the hunters from the neighboring village. Perhaps someone knows where this cabin came from. Before leaving, I scanned the room one more time, and that's when I noticed something strange. On the far wall hung a photograph, old and nearly faded. I walked closer. The picture showed a man in a forester's uniform. A black and white photo, probably very old. At first I didn't understand what exactly bothered me, but then it clicked, and I felt everything inside me turn to ice. This man looked like me. Not just a little bit, he looked exactly like me. So much so that for a moment, I thought I was looking at a photograph of myself taken 40 years ago. I stood and stared at the image for a few seconds. Then I turned away sharply, walked out of the cabin, closed the door, and headed to the car with a quick stride. That evening, for the first time in many years, I locked both my doors with both locks. And that night, I couldn't sleep for a long time because I kept thinking about one thing. Not the photo, not the warm mug, and not even the cabin itself. I was thinking about the fact that a week earlier, I had walked along that very same road, and I remembered for a fact there was no cabin there.
In the morning, I woke up earlier than usual. To be honest, I barely slept. All night long, the wind scraped the branches against the wall of the cabin, and one thought kept spinning in my head. Maybe age is catching up with me. Maybe yesterday I really did imagine it. It happens so many times. A person winds themselves up, sees something strange, and then builds a whole story in their own head. I tried to convince myself of exactly that. I put the kettle on, had breakfast, and packed my backpack. But the closer it got to the time I had to leave, the stronger the feeling became that I didn't want to go back to that cabin at all. And since I didn't want to, it meant I absolutely had to go. That's just my character. By noon, I was driving along the forest road. The weather was quiet. After several days of rain, the sun had finally come out. The wet pines glistened as if they had been varnished. The forest looked ordinary, calm, and for some reason that irritated me even more. It was too ordinary after what I'd seen yesterday. After 40 minutes, I reached the old clearing, stopped the car, got out, and immediately looked to where the cabin stood. It was in its place, just as it had been. Dark, old, as if it were waiting for me. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and walked toward it. This time I decided to carefully inspect the ground around it. After the rains, the soil was soft, so any track should have been well preserved. At first, nothing unusual appeared. My footprints from yesterday, rabbit tracks, a fox that had passed by at night. Then I noticed human tracks. Fresh, very fresh. So fresh that the edges hadn't even started to crumble yet. I crouched down. Size 42 roughly. Ordinary boots, nothing special. But a few seconds later, I realized what was wrong. The tracks began in the middle of the clearing, literally out of nowhere. I stood up, looked around, and walked in a circle. No, there was no mistake. The footprints appeared out of thin air, as if a person had emerged into the middle of the forest and headed to the cabin. The tracks led to the door and then vanished. No return tracks, no other paths, nothing. As if the person had entered and never come out again. I felt an unpleasant tension in my chest. My mind immediately started looking for an explanation. Maybe someone was walking on rocks or deliberately covering their tracks, but the ground all around was soft. To leave such even footprints and simultaneously hide the others was impossible. I spent another 10 minutes examining the clearing. The result was the same. The tracks appeared from nowhere and led into the cabin. Period. When I finally looked up, I discovered that I had been staring at the door for several minutes, as if I couldn't bring myself to approach it.
That made me angry. What was I, some kind of child? I took one step, then another, reached the door, and opened it. Inside, everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. The stove, the table, the bed, the photograph on the wall. I immediately looked at it. The man hadn't disappeared. Still the same look, the same facial features. The longer I looked at the shot, the more uneasy I felt. I looked away, walked up to the table, and that's when I noticed another oddity. On the tabletop lay a piece of bread. Fresh. So fresh the crust hadn't even hardened. I carefully touched it with my finger. Soft, as if it had been baked that morning. At that moment, I became truly anxious, because now this wasn't about an old photo or inexplicable tracks. It was about something else.
Someone had been here very recently, or was here right now. I spun around sharply. The room remained empty. Silence. Only the wood in the stove crackled faintly. I slowly turned my head. The stove. Yesterday, it had been cold. I remembered that for sure. Now, however, it radiated a faint heat. Not intense, but perceptible. As if the fire had gone out only a short while ago. Goosebumps ran down my spine. I walked closer and opened the door. Inside lay embers, dark, but some were still glowing. I stared at them and felt the anxiety beginning to rise within me. Someone had stoked the stove very recently. But where was that person? The cabin consisted of only one room. There was nowhere to hide here. I went outside and circled the house. Then I looked under the porch and inspected the nearest bushes. No one. As if the owner had dissolved into thin air. When I returned inside, I noticed the smell for the first time. Strange, barely perceptible, like smoke, but not from wood. Something else, something old, like the scent of a long abandoned house that for some reason had been preserved for decades. I looked at the photograph again and suddenly realized I wanted to take it off the wall. I don't know why. Maybe to examine it more closely. The frame turned out to be heavy. I flipped the picture over. On the back, there was an inscription made in pencil. The handwriting was uneven, elderly. With difficulty, I made out a few words. Do not stay here after sunset. Just one phrase and nothing more. It was as if I'd been doused with ice water. For a few seconds, I just stood there with the photo in my hands, then slowly put it back. The room felt crowded, even though its dimensions hadn't changed. The air felt as if it were pressing in from all sides.
I went outside and took a deep breath. The forest greeted me with total silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. And that was when I noticed one more detail. The sun had already begun to sink toward the horizon, and I had completely lost track of time. Inside the cabin, it had felt like 20 minutes had passed. In reality, it had been nearly 4 hours. 4 hours had vanished somewhere. I checked my watch, then checked it again. The hands weren't lying. Suddenly, I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, without explanations, without investigations, without trying to understand what was happening. I was already heading toward the car when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the cabin window, as if someone were standing inside watching me. I spun around sharply. The window was empty, but the feeling of being watched remained. The whole way back, I felt like I was making a mistake, because the answers were still back there, in the forest, in that cursed cabin. And for some reason, I was sure that very soon I would have to return again. After the second trip to the cabin, I decided not to tell anyone anything. I had the thought of calling a hunter I knew from the neighboring village. He had walked these places his whole life and knew the forest as well as I did. But what would I tell him? That I found a cabin that hadn't been there before? That footprints start out of thin air?
That someone is stoking a fire in an empty house? No, those kinds of stories are good to tell around a campfire after a bottle of moonshine. But in real life, they'll look at you like an old man whose age is starting to catch up with him. So, I kept my mouth shut. In the evening, I sat in my lodge and tried to do my normal chores.
I went through papers, filled out the logbook, and even turned on the old TV. But my thoughts kept returning to the cabin, especially to the inscription on the photograph. Do not stay here after sunset. Who wrote it? When? And most importantly, why? The darker it got outside the window, the more often I caught myself glancing at the clock, as if I were waiting for something, even though I didn't understand what it was. Around 10 p.m., I finally went to bed. The night was quiet, unusually quiet. Even the wind had died down. I tossed and turned for a long time. Then I finally started to drift off, and that's when I heard the sound. A knock. Very quiet. I opened my eyes and lay motionless for a few seconds. Imagination, I thought. Probably a branch hitting the glass. I closed my eyes again. Knock. This time louder. I sat up sharply in bed. The sound came from the window, which was only a couple of yards away from me. The room was dark, with only the faint light of the moon filtering through the curtains. I looked at the clock. 0:47. Knock, knock, knock. Now there was no doubt. Someone was truly knocking on the window. Not hard, not demanding, as if they just wanted to get my attention. A nasty tremor ran through my body. In the taiga, you rarely get guests at night, and if they do come, they usually call you by name or knock on the door. I got up carefully, trying not to make noise. I don't know why myself. I walked closer and stopped by the wall. The knocking stopped. Silence fell. It was so thick I could hear my own breathing. I took one more step and ripped the curtain aside. Someone was standing outside. I saw it immediately. A human silhouette, tall, motionless, only a few yards from the window. Something inside me seemed to snap, because the person wasn't moving at all. They were just standing there, looking at the house. I grabbed the flashlight lying on the windowsill, turned it on, and the beam of light struck the darkness. And that's when I saw the face. It was a man, about 50, maybe a bit older. A forester's uniform, old, almost identical to what they wore many years ago. But the scariest part wasn't the clothes. I had already seen this man in the photograph in the cabin. It was him, the same one. There was no way I was mistaken. The same facial features, the same look, even the scar near the chin. Everything matched. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. And then something completely abnormal happened. The man took a step back, another step, and dissolved among the trees. He didn't run, he didn't walk away, he literally dissolved, as if the darkness had swallowed him. I ran outside almost immediately. I didn't even put on a jacket. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam darting between the pines. No one. Absolutely no one. I circled the lodge, inspected the yard, and shone the light toward the forest. Empty. Only the damp grass glistened under the moonlight. Then I looked down at the ground and felt the cold inside me again. There were no tracks at all, not a single one. The man had stood by the window. I had seen him with my own eyes. But on the soft ground, there wasn't a single footprint, as if he had never been there at all. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the table. I didn't want to sleep anymore. I drank tea, looked out the window, and tried to understand what was happening. But there were fewer and fewer explanations. By morning, I had made a decision. I had to go back to the cabin immediately, before it was too late.
For some reason, that specific thought kept spinning in my head. Too late. For what, I didn't know, but the feeling was very strong. After dawn, I packed my things and headed into the forest. I knew the road by heart. An hour later, I was standing by the cabin. It looked exactly the same,
But now, something had changed. I noticed it immediately. The door was ajar. Yesterday, when leaving, I had closed it. I remembered that for a fact. Now there was a narrow gap between the door and the frame. I slowly approached and pushed the door. It opened without a creak. It was empty inside, but on the table lay an object that hadn't been there before. An old notebook in a worn leather cover. I froze. My heart started pounding even faster. I walked over and picked it up. Dusty, yellowed, very old. On the first page it was written, Diary of Forester Matthew Donewald, 1978. My hands trembled slightly because the photograph on the wall looked like it was from about the same time. I opened the first page. The handwriting was neat, clear. I started to read. The first entries were ordinary: forest rounds, weather, animal tracks, work notes. But then the text changed. The entries became shorter, more nervous, as if the man were writing in a hurry. On one of the pages I read, Today I saw the cabin near the old clearing again. I don't understand where it appears from. I froze. I turned the page. The next entry was made 3 days later. Locals say you shouldn't look for it on purpose. If the cabin shows itself to you, it means it's already too late. My mouth went dry. I continued, page after page.
Each entry became more anxious, and the further I read, the more I understood one thing. The man who had kept this diary nearly 50 years ago had encountered the exact same thing I was facing now. The same cabin, the same oddities, the same inexplicable events. And the last entry took up only one line, only 7 words. I reread them several times because at first I didn't believe my eyes. It read, "He is already coming for me. I can hear him." And that was where the diary ended. I reread the last entry from the diary 10 times. "He is already coming for me. I can hear him." And that was it. No explanations, no descriptions, no names. As if the person simply hadn't had time to write more. I closed the notebook and sat at the table for a long time. In the cabin, there was a deathly silence. Even the forest outside the walls seemed to have frozen. Usually, in the bush, there are always some sounds. A branch cracks, a bird cries, the wind rustles. Here, there was a feeling as if someone had covered the entire forest with a thick blanket. I looked at the clock, nearly 4 in the afternoon. There were a few hours left until dark. A normal person in my place would have left long ago, but I felt as if I'd been pulled in. In all these days, I hadn't gotten a step closer to the answers. On the contrary, every new find only added questions. I went outside, walked around the cabin, and inspected the trees, the clearing, the old clearing. Nothing. An ordinary forest. Only inside there was a constant feeling that I was being watched. Not right now, not from behind a specific tree, but in general. As if I had entered a place where I was not supposed to be. In about 2 hours, the sun began to drop toward the tops of the pines. That was exactly when I remembered the warning on the photograph. Do not stay here after sunset. The words were simple, but for some reason they wouldn't leave my head. I prepared to leave several times. I even walked to the car, then came back. I don't understand why. Maybe I wanted to see something with my own eyes, to understand why people left these warnings, why that forester from the diary was so scared. In the end, I decided to stay. Now I realize that was the stupidest thought of my entire life. When the sun touched the horizon, the forest began to change. At first, imperceptibly, gradually. I didn't even realize what was happening at first. I just suddenly realized that I hadn't heard birds for a long time. Then, the wind completely vanished. Not a single leaf moved. The pines stood motionless, as if painted. And then, the fog appeared. It crawled between the trees in thin white ribbons.
It didn't descend from above, it didn't rise from the ground. It seemed to seep directly out of the forest. In about 10 minutes, the entire clearing was covered in a gray mist. I stood by the car and felt the anxiety growing inside me. Experience told me that something here was wrong. Very, very wrong. And then, the first true miracle, or nightmare, happened. I still don't know what to call it. A light went on in the cabin window. I turned my head sharply. A warm yellow light, like from an old kerosene lamp. But there was no one in the house. I had checked it myself several times, and there had never been electricity here. Yet the light burned calmly, confidently, as if someone inside were going about their business. For a few minutes, I just watched. Then my feet carried me forward on their own. Each step was harder than the last.
When I reached the porch, my heart was already pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The door was locked, even though during the day it had been open. I grabbed the handle and pulled slowly. The door gave way, and I walked in. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake, that this wasn't the same cabin. The room looked much larger. Much, much larger. Even though from the outside, the size of the house hadn't changed. I froze on the threshold. To the right was the same stove, the same table, but further on, the space extended somewhere into the distance where the back wall used to be. I took a few steps. The floor creaked slightly under my feet. The air inside was warm, even too warm, as if the house had been well heated. The light came from several kerosene lamps. They hung on the walls, and they were all lit, even though the owner was still nowhere to be seen. That's when I noticed the photographs. Dozens of photographs. They covered almost the entire far wall. Black and white, old. Some had yellowed completely with time. I walked closer and felt my hands grow cold. The shots were of people. Men, women, sometimes children. Ordinary faces. Some I recognized immediately. One hunter had been searched for back in the 90s. He'd gone missing in the winter. They never found him. Another had been a tourist, disappeared about 15 years ago, also without a trace. I looked at the photographs and realized I knew too many of these people. I had participated in the searches for some personally, seen others only on missing persons flyers. But all of them were considered missing. All of them. Cold sweat ran down my spine. I took a step back, then another, and that's when I saw the door. It hadn't been here before. I was sure, absolutely sure.
An old wooden door stood at the end of the room, half open. A chill blew from behind it, a real winter cold, even though it was September outside. I stared at it for a long time, maybe for a minute, maybe for 5. Time inside the cabin behaved strangely. Then, a sound came from behind the door. A quiet, almost indistinguishable step. Then, another, as if someone were walking slowly through the snow directly toward me. I felt everything inside me constrict. The footsteps were approaching, slowly, calmly, without haste, as if whoever was behind the door knew perfectly well that I wasn't going anywhere. At that moment, I felt real fear for the first time. Not as an adult, not as an old forester, but as a frightened child who had accidentally found himself where he shouldn't have been. And then, the door began to open even wider, and the steps behind it suddenly stopped. The steps behind the door stopped. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling my heart hammering wildly. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe a few seconds. Maybe a full minute. Inside this cabin, time followed its own rules. The door remained ajar, and a chill blew from the gap as if behind it there was no autumn, but the middle of January. I should have left.
Now, years later, I understand this quite clearly. I should have turned around, run outside, and never come back. But humans are strange creatures. Sometimes fear makes you run, and sometimes it pushes you forward. I took a step toward the door, then another. The floor creaked quietly under my feet. The steps behind the door didn't repeat. The silence became so thick I could hear my own breathing. Approaching it, I carefully pushed the door. It opened completely, and I saw something I will never forget.
Behind the door was the forest, but not the same forest that was outside. This one looked dead. Gray sky, gray trees, gray snow on the ground. No wind, no sounds, no movement. It was as if someone had taken an ordinary forest and pulled all the life out of it. I stood on the threshold and couldn't look away. The distance to the nearest trees was only a few yards, and yet it seemed as if they were infinitely far away. In this place, the usual sensations didn't exist. I took a step forward. My boot touched the snow. Real, cold, dense snow. Behind my back, the cabin remained. Before me lay this strange, lifeless forest. And then I saw the person. He stood among the trees, about 20 yards away. A tall old man in an old forester's uniform, gray beard, hunched shoulders. He was looking at me calmly, without malice, without surprise, as if he had been waiting for a long time. I didn't even notice myself walking toward him. The snow crunched quietly under my feet. The old man didn't move. When about 5 yards remained between us, he finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, old, the kind of voice a person has who has been silent for too long. "You've been walking a long time." I stopped. "Who are you?" The old man smirked. Once, I asked the same question to the one who stood here before me. A chill ran down my spine. I immediately remembered the diary, the photograph, the disappeared forester. The old man seemed to read my thoughts. Yes, I'm that very one. For a few seconds, I just looked at him. I didn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Before me stood a man who should have disappeared nearly 50 years ago. But he looked perfectly real, alive, and at the same time, somehow wrong, as if he belonged to this place more than to the ordinary world. "What is this place?" I asked. The old man was silent for a long time, then looked at the gray forest all around. "No one knows for sure. Even those who ended up here before me. We called it different things. A trap, a border, the forgotten side of the forest. And the cabin is a door." Those words made me feel uneasy. The old man took a few steps through the snow, and "It doesn't appear everywhere, and not always. Only when it needs a new master." "What kind of master?" He looked at me with a long stare. And for some reason, at that moment, I already knew the answer. I just didn't want to hear it. "One like me." The forest all around remained motionless. Even the snow here seemed dead. "You mean to say—" "No," he interrupted. "I don't want to. But that's how this place is built." We stopped by a huge pine. Its trunk was gray, like stone. "Once I was a forester too. Saw the cabin, started looking for answers. It was all just like you." He spoke calmly, as if he were telling a long-learned story. "Then I came here and couldn't get out." The old man smirked. "I would have, if I'd left immediately." I felt an unpleasant lump in my throat, because I understood perfectly well what he was driving at. All the warnings, all the notes, all the oddities, they weren't about finding a solution. They were about leaving in time. And the people in the photographs? The old man lowered his gaze. Some went in too deep. Some decided to stay themselves. Some just didn't find the way back. It became hard for me to breathe. Only one thought spun in my head. Must leave immediately. As if sensing this, the old man suddenly looked somewhere behind my back. His face changed for the first time during our whole conversation. Concern appeared in his eyes.
Too late. What is too late? He didn't answer. I turned around and saw movement among the trees. Something was moving through the forest. Very far away, but fast. Too fast. A dark silhouette flickered between the trunks. Human and simultaneously not. I couldn't see it clearly, as if my gaze refused to do so. But I understood one thing for sure. This creature was moving toward us. The old man grabbed my sleeve sharply. "Run to the cabin!" In his voice, fear appeared for the first time. Real, animal fear. I bolted. The snow crunched under my feet. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Heavy, fast, not mine. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was chasing me through this dead forest. Ahead, the cabin appeared. The door was open. The light from inside seemed to be the only living spot in this entire gray world. I literally flew inside, fell onto the wooden floor, rolled over, and slammed the door shut. At that very moment, something hit it from the outside so hard that the entire house shuddered. Another hit, then another. I pressed my shoulder against the door. I don't know why. If that creature had wanted to come in, that wouldn't have saved me. But a few seconds later, everything went quiet. Silence fell. I got up and looked around. The cabin had become ordinary again. No long room, no photographs, no second door. Only the table, the stove, the bed. Just like the first day. I ran outside. There was no one in the clearing. The fog had vanished. The forest looked ordinary, alive, real. And behind my back, the cabin was gone. In its place, young pines were growing, as if the house had never existed. Many years have passed since then. I retired a long time ago. I rarely venture into the remote parts of the taiga, but sometimes in winter, when I stand at the old clearing, it seems to me that a warm yellow light is flickering among the trees, as if someone has lit a lamp in the window. And every time I turn away, because now I know one thing. Some doors in the forest do not exist to be opened.